The hotel employee pressed a small brass key into my palm and said the 6 words that would end my family as I knew it. Your grandmother said you'd know. I didn't know. Not yet. I was standing at the edge of a ballroom filled with 220 people who had gathered to celebrate my sister's engagement, and I was holding a piece of metal that felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried in my life. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Tessa Callahan, and for 29 years I was the daughter my family apologized for. Not out loud. Never out loud. It was quieter than that. It was in the way my mother's smile tightened when someone asked what I did for work. It was in the way my father introduced my sister first at every dinner party, every fundraiser, every holiday gathering, as if I were an afterthought he hoped people wouldn't notice standing behind her. Brielle went to Harvard. Brielle graduated with honors. Brielle could read a 200-page contract in an evening and remember every clause. I have dyslexia. Letters used to swim on the page when I was a little girl, rearranging themselves like they were mocking me. And by the time anyone figured out what was actually happening, my parents had already decided what it meant about me. Not that I processed information differently, that I processed it less. My father, Grant Callahan, runs Callahan Development Group, a real estate and construction empire worth somewhere around $118 million, built from nothing by his mother, my grandmother, Beatrice. Beatrice started with a single crew renovating row houses in Charleston back when nobody wanted to touch a historic property. By the time she was finished, the Callahan name was on hotels, waterfront developments, and half the restored buildings downtown. My father inherited the company. He did not inherit her philosophy. Beatrice used to say, a company is something you build for the people who come after you. My father built his life around the idea that the company was something he owned, the way you own a house or a car, something that existed to serve him. I got a job there anyway, 3 years out of college, because despite everything, I loved the work. Not the spreadsheets, the patterns. Give me a stack of property records, ownership histories, old contracts, renovation costs, and I can see how they connect in a way that other people can't. I don't memorize information. I understand how it moves. My grandmother noticed that about me back when I was 12 years old and struggling through a reading assignment at her kitchen table. She didn't tell me to try harder. She asked me how I understood things best. When I showed her the diagram I'd drawn instead of writing the essay, she went quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I've never forgotten. Never confuse reading slowly with thinking slowly, Tessa. I held on to that sentence for the rest of my life, mostly because almost nobody else in my family ever said anything like it to me. My father hired me into Callahan Development Group as a property records analyst. It's a low position. Brielle, by then, was already being groomed for an executive track, sitting in on board meetings, shadowing regional directors, being introduced to investors as the future of the company. I sat in a small office 3 floors below her, going through property files nobody else wanted to touch. And that's where I found it. A pattern in the ownership structure of the company's most valuable asset, a waterfront property downtown, tied to some kind of founder shares that didn't match anything in our current corporate records. I brought it to my father. I remember standing in his office, watching him barely glance at the pages I'd printed out. "You don't understand corporate structure, Tessa," he said. "Leave that to people who do." I went back to my desk. I didn't argue, but I didn't stop looking either, because my grandmother had told me something else years before she died. When someone tells you you don't understand something, don't argue with them. Go find the document. At the time, I thought she was just being kind to a granddaughter who struggled in school. I didn't understand she was preparing me. Beatrice passed away 4 years ago. My father handled everything. He told the family her estate had been settled quietly, the way she wanted. Brielle received a significant portion of family assets and continued financial support. I received almost nothing. I told myself it didn't matter, that maybe my grandmother simply hadn't wanted to complicate an already difficult time. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true, because the alternative was believing that even in death, I still hadn't mattered enough. I was wrong about that. My grandmother hadn't forgotten me. She had simply chosen the right moment. And that moment came 2 years later, in a ballroom at the Charleston Place, on the night of my sister's engagement party. My father stood at the front of the room in his tailored navy suit, tapping a fork against a champagne glass until the room quieted down. "I want to say something," he announced, his voice carrying the particular warmth he reserved for public occasions. "Brielle has always been the future of this family, and soon she'll be the future of Callahan Development Group." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Business partners raised their glasses. Family friends turned to congratulate my parents. I clapped too, because what else was I going to do? And I told myself the familiar lie that I had made peace with this a long time ago. That's when the hotel employee found me near the edge of the room and handed me the key. I left the party without telling anyone. I sat in my car in the parking garage with the key in my hand, turning it over and over, looking at the small engraved number stamped into the metal. I recognized it. My grandmother had shown me a similar number once, years earlier, on an old document she never fully explained. I made a call that night to a private bank downtown, and the next morning I was standing in front of a safety deposit box that had been waiting for me for 2 years. Inside was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting. It began, "If you're reading this, your father has finally made the mistake I spent years preparing for." My hands were shaking by the second paragraph. The box contained the original founder agreement for Callahan Development Group, an old ledger, a set of ownership documents, a sealed legal instrument, and a small flash drive. What I learned over the next several hours changed everything I thought I understood about my family. My grandmother had retained a set of founder voting rights when she stepped back from the company. Those rights were never transferred to my father. He believed, and had told the entire board, that he held full control. He didn't. My grandmother had quietly assigned those rights to me, with an activation clause. I had 5 business days to formally exercise them. If I did nothing, they would fold automatically into a family trust my father controlled, and this opportunity would disappear forever. I sat in that small bank room and understood for the first time in my life that I wasn't simply an overlooked daughter. I was the one person in my family who had actually been prepared for something. There was more. Buried in the documents was evidence that my father was preparing to transfer the company's waterfront property, the same one I'd flagged months earlier, into a new development structure that would give him enormous personal control and financial benefit, entirely outside the board's oversight. But my grandmother's original founder agreement required approval from the founder voting bloc before any such transfer could happen. She hadn't just protected me. She had built a safeguard for the entire company and left me the key to it. I called Dorothy Whitcomb, a board member who had worked alongside my grandmother for over 20 years. I hadn't spoken to her much since Beatrice's funeral, but she answered on the second ring, and when I told her what I'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Your grandmother came to me before she died," Dorothy finally said. "She was worried about your father's direction. Several of us were. Nobody wanted to be the one to challenge him first." "Well," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded, "I guess that's me now." My father found out within 2 days. He called me into his office, and for the first time in my life, I watched him look genuinely unsettled. "You're misunderstanding the paperwork," he said. "This isn't what you think it is." Brielle called me that same night, her voice sharp with betrayal. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family? Grandma's been dead for 2 years, Tessa. Let it go." "I'm not asking you to believe me," I told her, and I meant it. "I'm asking you to read the documents." I didn't storm into a boardroom and demand control. That's not who my grandmother raised me to be, even if she wasn't the one who technically raised me. I requested an independent shareholder review instead, the proper channel, the legitimate path. My father was confident I would fail. He assumed the board would side with him the way they always had. But the review turned up exactly what the document suggested. Several questionable transactions connected to the waterfront property, structured in ways that benefited my father personally at the company's expense. What had started as a family disagreement had become a serious governance matter. The emergency board meeting took place 2 weeks later in the same downtown headquarters my grandmother had built from a single renovation crew decades earlier. My father sat at the head of the table. Brielle sat near him, arms crossed, refusing to look at me. I walked in with a single folder. No lawyers standing behind me, no dramatic entrance, just paper and truth. My father tried to undercut me before I even opened the folder. "Let's be honest about what's happening here," he said to the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My daughter has dyslexia. She has no business background, no legal training. She is not equipped to be making claims about corporate governance." I felt the old sting of it, the same shame I'd carried since childhood, the same voice that used to make me shrink in classrooms and dinner tables and every room where someone decided I was less than what I actually was. But this time, for the first time in my life, I let it pass through me instead of settling in. I thought about all the years I'd spent quietly accepting that judgment, believing there was something true underneath it. And I realized my father had never once actually looked at the evidence in front of him. Not when I brought him the waterfront documents months earlier, and not now. He had simply decided, a long time ago, exactly who I was allowed to be. "I read slowly," I said, keeping my voice even. "I never said I don't think clearly." Then I opened the folder. I laid out the founder agreement first, then the ownership ledger, then the voting rights clause, then the waterfront documents, one piece at a time, slow enough for every person in that room to follow the thread. I watched the expressions around the table shift as the pattern became impossible to ignore. And then I played the final piece, the recording from the flash drive. My grandmother appeared on the screen, sitting in the same chair she used to sit in at her kitchen table, looking directly into the camera, as though she somehow knew exactly who would be in this room when the recording finally played. "I created this arrangement," she said, "because I was afraid my son would eventually put control above the health of the company I built. I chose Tessa because she always asked the questions everyone else was too afraid to ask." The room went completely silent. I watched my father's face change, watched him understand, maybe for the first time, that his own mother had seen this exact moment coming years before it arrived. The board's independent counsel confirmed the founder voting rights were valid. I now held decisive influence over the company's future, more than my father had, more than Brielle ever would have. Everyone in that room expected me to use it the way he would have used it against me. Instead, I said, "I'm not here to become my father." I proposed an independent vote on his continued leadership, rather than demanding his removal myself. The board voted. It went against him. He was transitioned out of operational control over the following months, not through humiliation, not through revenge, but through the plain accountability my grandmother had built into the company's foundation decades earlier. When the board turned to me afterward, certain I would take the CEO position, I turned it down. "I know what I'm good at," I told them, "and I know what I'm not. I don't need my father's title to prove either one. I supported an outside executive search instead, and built a new division inside the company focused on historic preservation and community-centered redevelopment, work that actually matched who I was, work my grandmother would have recognized immediately. My mother came to see me privately a few weeks later. She admitted, quietly, that she had spent years telling herself that protecting the family's image was the same thing as protecting me. It wasn't an excuse. It was closer to an apology than she'd ever managed before. I told her I couldn't erase what happened, but I could decide what happened next. We're still rebuilding, slowly, the two of us. Brielle reached out months after that. She admitted she'd known, on some level, that I was being treated unfairly, and that she'd stayed quiet because she was afraid that challenging our father would cost her the place she'd worked so hard for. I understood the fear, even though I didn't excuse the silence. We didn't become close overnight, but we agreed to start over, and that felt like enough. I went back to my grandmother's old house not long ago and stood in front of a photograph of her outside the company's very first building, young and sunburned and proud. I finally understood why she chose me. It was never because I was smarter than my sister, and it was never because Brielle didn't deserve her success. It was because my grandmother believed I understood the difference between having power and abusing it. And she was right to believe that, because when I finally had the chance to become exactly what had hurt me for so many years, I chose not to. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The biggest lie my family ever told me wasn't that I was incapable, it was that I needed their approval to become valuable. My dyslexia never made me less intelligent. Being overlooked never meant I had nothing to offer. I simply needed the chance to discover my own strengths on my own terms. My grandmother didn't give me her courage. She just showed me it had been there the entire time. If this story moved you, if you've ever been the one your family underestimated, the one written off before anyone bothered to really look, subscribe to the Family Revenge Tales, because your story matters just as much as Tessa's did, and there are more stories like this one waiting for you here. And remember, you don't have to become the person who hurt you just because you finally have the power to hurt them back. Sometimes the strongest kind of justice is simply refusing to repeat what was done to you. What makes this story valuable beyond its entertainment is the honest look it takes at how families quietly assign worth to their children, often based on how easily someone fits a narrow definition of success, and how damaging that quiet favoritism can be, even when no one intends real cruelty. It challenges the assumption that a learning difference like dyslexia reflects intelligence or capability, showing instead that different minds simply process the world in different ways, and that those differences can become genuine strengths when someone finally has the chance to use them. The story also offers a meaningful lesson about power itself, that gaining leverage over the people who hurt you is not the same thing as justice, and that real strength often looks like restraint, accountability, and rebuilding rather than domination. Finally, it speaks to anyone who has ever needed external validation to believe in their own worth, reminding viewers that the ability to change your circumstances was very likely inside you long before anyone else recognized it.